This is an interesting lesson for me. It's hopefully an interesting lesson for you. It is part one of two parts on the Archaeology and Judges. And so let's work together through this. I will tell you, one of the things I love to do as a lawyer is I get to travel around the country and give lectures on how to try lawsuits. And Dr. Bob's down here with me. He and I have worked over the last however many years, I guess I've been doing this for 26 years, to try to figure out the best way as a lawyer to connect and explain to a jury my belief of what happened. And that's what I do as a lawyer. I try to say, and you don't just walk in and do some Perry Mason thing. For every trial that takes place, there's years of preparation. In law, it's called discovery. You take depositions, which is sworn testimony under oath, so you'll know what witnesses are going to say when they get to the stand. You can pose written questions. You can do document requests where you get to see all of the evidence and the documents that are out there. And if you've ever been through it, you know that it's not fun for anyone, except the lawyers. Lawyers actually are this weird breed of cat that enjoy that. And it's fascinating, but when you get down to the actual trial, what a lawyer's got to do is figure out how to present their case, how to tell the story of their client. And when lawyers do that, every lawyer who's done it much at all immediately recognizes that there are probably three different kinds of facts that you've got. There are those that help you. And when I try lawsuits, I draw 3 columns on a page like I did on this overhead slide, and I'll put helpful facts. I want to know which facts help me. And then there are a lot of facts that are neutral. They don't particularly help you, but they don't particularly hurt you. And then there are the bad facts. These are the facts that exist, and it's why there is a lawsuit. There are 2 sides. These are the facts that I've been waiting 27 years to get a case without bad facts. I'm still waiting. They're out there. And as lawyers, you learn how to deal with this. And most lawyers, well, let me give you an example. Let's use an actual case that Bob and I tried. There was a case where a fellow was involved in, before I put it up there, there's a fella who's about 72 years old, and he's walking in this massive industrial complex. There are train tracks all over the place. There are big units. It's a big refinery-type atmosphere. And he walks, and he gets hit by a train, and it kills him. Now, at first blush, this was not a case that we would normally take, because you can't argue the train should have swerved. You know, this guy should have seen the train. The train's a big thing. Maybe couldn't hear it because of all the industrial noise, but should have at least seen it. But we took the case anyway because during the discovery process, we found out there were 8 things wrong with the train. The train was speeding. The train didn't have a lookout. The speedometer was broken on the train. The engineer never sounded the horn, which he certainly could have heard. And all of these different things added up. There were 8 things wrong with the train. So that's a good fact for us. I represented his widow. So that's a good fact. You see that? Okay, here's a neutral fact. He got hit by a train. That doesn't help us. It doesn't hurt us. That's just a fact. Both sides have to live with it. Here's the hurtful fact. The man should have been looking out better. Stop, look, and listen before you cross the street, but also before you cross the train tracks. And true, there's big tanks, and it's hard to see it until it's right up upon you. And yes, to some degree, maybe he'd have had to have kind of do this number, and he could have lost his head the way that train was steaming down the tracks, but he's still got responsibility. Now, what a baby lawyer does when they try these cases is they take the helpful facts and they'll pound on them for the jury. And they'll hope that the other side never figures out the bad facts. It's just, you just want to ignore them and pretend they're not there. And then good lawyers, so-so lawyers, they'll say, look, here are the helpful facts. And if you're the jury, they say this, here are my helpful facts. And there's this bad fact or two over here, but the helpful ones really outweigh the bad ones, so go with me in my story. But what I travel around the country and tell lawyers is to try a different approach. Here's my suggestion to the lawyer. Tell the truth. Now that shocks lawyers sometimes. But the real truth includes all of the facts. You can't put on blinders and ignore certain facts. And the truth of the matter in that case is, this fella did something wrong. In fact, Bob and I think he did two things wrong. He didn't look and he wasn't paying attention. But the train also did things wrong. The railroad company lawyer didn't do it that way. He tried it the way young lawyers do. He said it was all my fella's fault. It doesn't matter that we didn't sound the horn, that we were speeding, that our speedometer was broken, and that we didn't have a lookout, and that we weren't paying attention, and our guy was sleeping while he was driving the train. Didn't put on the brakes, didn't do any of that. None of that matters. Well, the jury is a smart group of people like you. And they assess the credibility of the lawyer. Is the lawyer an honest fella or gal, or is it dishonest? And the person who tells the whole truth and really considers all of the facts is the person that's going to better have credibility with the jury. Does this make sense? As a trial lawyer, this is the way I think. This is my training, and this is the way I train others. And I tell you that because it's almost like trying a lawsuit when you sit down to try to figure out what happened in the book of Judges and how it connects to the archaeological evidence and opinions of the experts. Because there really are some facts, I won't say that are helpful. Instead, when we look at Judges, let's do it this way. There are what we may call alleged inconsistencies instead of bad facts. In other words, here's where Judges people say flat out, here's why we know Judges cannot be a historical record, because it is inconsistent with what we know to be the truth. And then there are usually three different things that are listed there. We'll go into them in a minute in more detail. There's the chronology issue, alleged contradictions with other parts of Scripture, specifically Joshua, and then the whole issue of where these Israelites came from. All of these are alleged inconsistencies. That's what I want to deal with today. But I want to tell you that this week and next week, we'll see that some of those actually don't belong in that column. I think they belong in the middle column. I think there are some neutral facts. And then next week, I want to look at the consistencies between archaeology and the book of Judges and see, here's my goal. I think the truth includes all of the facts in front of us. And I don't want to put on blinders. I don't want to put on blinders because I have my own opinion and I want to read Scripture to make it consistent with what I already believe. But I don't want to put on blinders to push a non-Scripture belief that I already have. Because when you read through the academic material, you'll find that 90% of the people writing really seem to have an agenda. It's either to disprove the Bible or to prove the Bible. And there is a concern that I've got that in the effort to do those two tasks, sometimes people put on blinders to whichever facts don't align with their preformed opinion. And you'd lose a jury if you try that in trial. So what I want us to do, and what we'll do in the second part of this lesson next week, is take the totality of all of the facts together and see if there's not a coherent story that explains all of these different things and does so in such a way, at least I believe, I'll tell you now the end result of this, is that the Bible is reliable. Specifically, the book of Judges is reliable. Not just for imparting some theological niceties, not just for illustrating some later agenda within Israel at some other point in time, but simply reliable for telling us and revealing to us how God and man were actually dealing with each other in that point in time in history. And so I want us to look at it, and I want us to do that. I want us to tell the truth. And the truth's going to include all of the facts, those that are consistent, those that are neutral, and those that at least are alleged to be inconsistent. And I'm going to start with what those who view this differently than me set out first. Let's deal first with those inconsistencies. The first one is chronology. Now, here's the complaint. The complaint is that the chronology that's given in Judges is impossible for someone to accept. See, Judges gives chronologies. It says this judge lived for 40 years and judged for 18 years there was oppression, and then the judge lived for 40 years. Or this judge came after there was 10 years of oppression, and he ruled for 20 years, or whatever. And you can add all of that up. And here's what happens. You do it, and skeptics do it, and they do it in reference to this passage in 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says, Solomon started building the temple 480 years after the Exodus, during the 4th year of his reign. So scholars say 480 years after the Exodus, you've got Solomon in the 4th year of his reign. Now, this is a math problem for my middle school daughters. I mean, this is pretty simple. If 480 years existed between the Exodus and year 4 of Solomon's reign, then just add up all the numbers and it should be 480. And if it is, the Bible's reliable, and if it's not, throw it in the trash. Well, you can't do that. Now, we dealt in an earlier lesson with the idea that the 480 is actually probably a reflection of the generations that existed. And they just used the common generation figure of 40 years per generation. So that's probably not as long of a number as it should have been. But that makes our problem even worse. Let me show you why. Moses, how long were they in the wilderness after the Exodus? 40 years. Then you got Joshua. Well, we don't know how long Joshua was running things and how long he was doing things. Scholars differ on that. 15 years, who knows? So I just put a question mark. Then what do we have after Joshua? The elders ruled Israel until the coming of the judges. So now we got Moses for 40 years, Joshua for some unknown years, the elders for some unknown years, and then we got the judges. And if you add all of their years together, you get exactly 400. Or at least I did. I added it twice. 400 years for the judges. Now you're starting to see a problem here, aren't you? Especially when you figure after the judges you get Samuel. And we have him from birth all the way up till he becomes an old man. Samuel anoints Saul as king. Saul's king long enough for the little shepherd boy, David, to kill Goliath. Saul's king long enough to chase David down. David becomes a man. David becomes married. David becomes a father. There's a lot that happens. Then you've got the entire reign of King David. And you've got all of that plus 4 years of Solomon. And all of that has to total over 480, right? So the skeptic will look at the Bible and they'll look at Judges and they'll say, Judges cannot be historically reliable or accurate. It can't be valid history because it doesn't add up. 2 plus 2 has to equal 4, even for the Bible. Now, what do we do with this? Well, one thing to do is just to say, yeah, you're right, and walk away. Another thing to do is to say, no, you're wrong, that doesn't change my belief. God said it, I believe it, that settles it, and just walk away. But I think the more fair thing to do is to actually look at it and try to weigh the merits of the discussion. Try to understand what the facts really are. And so that's what I want us to do. And we spent last week talking about how the book of Judges was written, and I made a strong point I want to remind you, that it was not written chronologically. It was written in a very specific Hebrew form. Remember, we talked about the chiasm in it? It's not chronological. It's not orderly. And what's more is we talked last week about the idea that judges were not an official elected position that made them ruler over all 12 tribes. The judges were almost warlords for their area, who stepped in at the right time, called by God, and worked God's purposes to free people under the thumb of the oppressor. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that judges isn't 400 years. Some of those judges were serving at the same time in different parts of the country. If you look at the 12 tribes of Israel, and I've grabbed the slide that Dale Hearn used in his class on this. If we look at the 12 tribes of Israel, you can see where the judges served because it tells us. It tells us about Deborah and Barak starting down in Ephraim and chasing Sisera the king, the general, the opposing general, all the way up towards Galilee. And that's where Deborah ruled. It talks about the Othniel and Ibzan who ruled down in the southern part of Judah and Simeon. It talks about those Shambar and Samson who fought the Philistines along the coast of Judah and Dan. Talks about Ehud, the left-handed guy who went through the king over there in Benjamin, the king that had crossed the Jordan over by the Jordan River. Talks about Abdon and Tola who were ruling in Ephraim. Talks about the rulers on the the east side of the Jordan River, Jerah and Jephthah. Talks about Gideon who ruled and Elon who ruled up in the northern areas. So these judges were doing their thing, many of them at the same time. You can't just add all those years together. It's no more fair than to say, I'm 50 years old. My son Will is 26 years old. So those Laniers have been around for 76 years. Well, no, they've been around for 50 years. 26 of them, there were 2 of us. And please understand, earlier scholars threw this fuss out. But as this chronology gets fleshed out, you don't read it in very intellectual circles anymore. It's kind of a neutral fact. You can't use it to prove the accuracy of the story, but you can't use it to disprove it. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's get that out of that column and let's make it neutral. Now, what about the next one? What about these alleged contradictions with Joshua? This is the one that really sticks in my craw. I doubt that anybody who ever writes on this from any opposing viewpoint of mine would ever watch this on the internet. But if you do, would you please call me? I am very disturbed by what you've written. It's just not intellectually honest, in my opinion. And I'm not saying they're dishonest people. I'm saying they're people who haven't done their homework the way I think they should. There are 2 alleged contradictions that they complain about. And the first one is an allegation that you see over and over and over again. Let me give you some examples of it. Here is a book by a scholar named John McDermott. What are they saying about? What are they? It makes it sound like this is just honest reporting. What are they saying about the formation of Israel? Now, this is a book put out by Paulist Press. It's not an old book. It's 1998. It's the copyright date. Let's zoom in a little bit here. So we're not, we can't say, oh, hang on, there's a way to automatically focus there. 1998. You can say, oh, gee, that's real old. No, that's not that old in academic circles. It's not that old for this. Look at the very first page, chapter 1, the issue. Down at the bottom, here's what it says. It is clear. You see where it says it is clear? It is clear that there are problems with viewing the biblical description of Israel's beginnings as literal history. The first, and this is the first one he lists, like really important, like simple, like no-brainer. The first is that there are contradictions between different parts of the Bible. Joshua says the conquest was completely successful. And he quotes Joshua 11, where it says Joshua took all that land, the hill country, the Negeb, all the land of Goshen, the lowland, the Arabah, hill country of Israel and its lowland from Mount Halak, which rises toward Sierra as far as Baal-Gad, in the valley of Lebanon below Mount Hermon. He took all their kings and struck them down and put them to death. Then he goes on to say, chapter 12 of Joshua goes on to list the conquered kings and the cities, including Jerusalem, also called Jebus, Hebron, Tanakh, among others. It says the book of Judges gives a very different picture. It opens with a description of the places not yet conquered by the Israelites. The unconquered territory includes the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, the Negeb, the lowland, the cities of Jebus, Jerusalem, Hebron, and Tanakh. Some of the very same places Joshua says were successfully conquered. Okay? So some of the same places Joshua says were successfully conquered, Judges documents as not yet conquered. Now you're reading this book and you're thinking, ugh, that looks bad. Or maybe you didn't pick up that book. Maybe you picked up a book which is edited by a lawyer named Herschel Shanks. Herschel Shanks is the owner, I think, as well, isn't he, of Biblical Archaeological Review, which is a journal that maybe you see. It's got scholastic articles in it. And he put a revised and expanded edition out of a book on ancient Israel. And in this book that he edited, there is an article by originally a fellow named Joseph Calloway, who was a Southern Baptist minister, taught at Southern Seminary. In fact, I think their museum's named after him up in Kentucky. And I don't know what his original work was, but I can tell you that this revision by J. Maxwell Miller, who is a well-known scholar, and Miller, in fact, at Lipscomb, one of my textbooks in an Old Testament survey, was written by Miller and Hayes. This fellow's well-known for his what I would call non-historical view of the Old Testament. I think he would agree with me. He's got in this article on the settlement in Canaan in the period of the Judges, the very first thing they say, the first subdivision, is entitled Joshua versus Judges. And he says, Joshua 21:43 summarizes the view that the Lord gave to Israel all the land which he swore to give their fathers, and having taken possession of it, they settled there. But quite a different view of the conquest and settlement in Canaan emerges in the book of Judges. The events related in that book reportedly come after the death of Joshua, and the picture of Israel and Canaan is not what one would expect from reading the book of Joshua. And he goes on to say much the same thing. You'll see it down here. In contrast to the sweeping statements in Joshua that Israel wiped out the inhabitants of the land, Judges 1 concludes with a list of 20 cities where the people were not driven out. And this list includes, look at there, skip down, Jerusalem, Beth-Shan, Tanakh, Dor, Ibleam, Megiddo, Gezer, Beth-Shemesh. In the summary of Israel's victories in Joshua, however, it's expressly stated that Jerusalem, Gezer, these cities were defeated by Joshua. So in Judges, these specific cities are not defeated. In Joshua, they were. Now, this is not just in these two books. You'll find this over and over and over again. And I'm all for intellectual honesty. And if the intellectual truth is that this story is not, the Judges or Joshua, one or the other or both, are not written to be history, but are written to use a historical idea to teach a theological truth. If that's what God chose to do in His revelation, well, He's God and He can do that however He chooses. But I don't want to make that leap if that leap doesn't need to be made. Does that make sense? I'm not ready to give up my position yet, in other words, until I see that something's wrong with my position. And these fellas can write and say something's wrong with my position, but they don't do a good job with it. Let me show you why. What I urge people to do is to consider actually reading the Scriptures and not what they say the Scriptures say. Kind of a novel idea. In legal circles, we call it sight checking. Go back and look at it. Does it say what they say it says? And that's the question. So in that regard, let's look. Judges 1. Here's what Judges 1, verse 21 says. Hold on, I don't like that pen. Yeah, this is the one I like. Advertisement for this pen on the internet. Best writing pen there is. Pilot G2. Okay. We are in the book of Judges. See, Judges. We are chapter 1. These are the verses that they cite. Here's chapter 1, verse 21. The people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. Jebus, Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Okay, now Judges, this is Judges, remember? Judges says they did not drive them out of Jerusalem. And look, down here. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bethshean, or Tanakh and its villages, or Dor, or Ibleam, or Megiddo. For the Canaanite peoples persisted in dwelling in that land. See that? Now, I want you with me on this. They did not drive out who? Say the word. Inhabitants. They did not drive out the inhabitants. Look up at Jerusalem. They did not drive out the Jebusites, who are the inhabitants of Jebus. They didn't drive out the inhabitants. What's an inhabitant? It's someone who lives there. They inhabit, right? Are you an inhabitant of your city and town? They didn't drive you out. Now let's see what supposedly contradicts this passage in Judges. This passage, we're told, is contradicted by Joshua 12. Here's what Joshua 12 says. And these are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the people of Israel defeated on the west side of the Jordan. You with me? And it lists a bunch of the kings. And so we are still in Judges chapter 12, and it lists that Joshua defeated the king of Jerusalem, and it does list the king of Gezer. It does list the king of some of these other towns, the king of Tanakh, the king of Megiddo, the king of Dor. It lists them. He beat the kings. Say king. Okay. Now, read the entire chapter and the chapters in front of it. You know what happened? Let's take Jerusalem, Jebus. The king of Jerusalem sees that Joshua is getting pretty successful in the land, and so he gathers the surrounding kings from the surrounding towns, says, get your army together, let's take our armies out, and let's go fight, initially, an ally of Israel, Gibeon. And they go to do it, and Joshua brings the Israelites to fight them, and they have a big fight there in the middle of the fields. And who wins? Joshua. They chase the kings down. They find them in a cave, and they kill the kings. Joshua says, we killed the kings. They did. They beat the army, and they killed the kings. And do you know what happened? After they did that, the soldiers that were not killed in battle went back to the towns that were fortified. I didn't make this up. It's in the text. When Joshua, here's the story. It's back in chapter 10. When Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking them with a great blow until they were wiped out. And when the remnant that remained of them had entered into the fortified cities, then all the people returned safe to Joshua in the camp at Makkedah, and that's where they brought out the 5 kings and killed them because they were hiding in the cave near there. Okay, so what happened? What are all the facts? Don't find one verse here and one verse there and set them up as Joshua versus Judges. Read me the text and the context. Give me all the facts, and the facts are these. Joshua is having great success throughout the land. All, the Hebrew word all, this is Weston's footnote in our paper, is better translated throughout. It doesn't mean all in the sense of every single square inch. That's like same principle with the Greek word pas. It doesn't mean all, the way we use the word. We got to be careful there. Because you'll go back and read in Matthew that all Jerusalem and all Judea went out to John the Baptist to be baptized. I promise you, that didn't include Pilate, didn't include the chief priest. That all Judea goes out there doesn't mean our sense of all. It means throughout. It means head to toe. It means throughout the land, Joshua was successful. But it doesn't mean he drove out every person, because the text itself tells us the opposite. It says that the kings would join up in battle. Joshua killed the kings, but the soldiers, the remnant that remained, went back into the fortified cities. So now, are you shocked to be reading that sometime later, maybe 50 years, maybe 75 years, maybe 30 years, we don't know. But are you shocked to find out that there are still foreign inhabitants in those cities? Of course not. The Joshua text never says that those cities were wiped out, every person within them. That happened only in 3 places: Ai, Jericho, and Hazor. Those are the only 3 places Joshua says that. In the other places, heavens, you've got an Israelite army coming to wipe you out. You've got your family there. What are you going to do? I'm going to leave by the back gate. Let things settle down. Let the army move on down the road. Then I'll come back home and see if they left any fresh vegetables. And if this is real, then read it real life. Don't read it antiseptically with blinders on that only select the verses and the passages that support your perspective. Because that's what these scholars are doing there. These passages, they inaccurately restate the Bible when they make this argument. That's not the claim the Bible's making in Joshua or Judges. And I would debate till the cows come home anybody who says these passages mean otherwise, because they just don't. When you read them in context, that's what they say. Now, there is another place where the argument is made that Joshua and Judges contradict each other. So I want to set aside the question of these cities and give you the second one. The second one concerns a fellow named Jabin. There is a fellow named Jabin, and Jabin in Joshua, let me get to C1. Here is Jabin in Joshua, chapter 11. When Jabin, king of Hazor, and Hazor is this massive, Weston and others who've been out there will tell you it's this massive city that for old time's sakes. It was clearly the lead city within that area of Israel at the time, or Canaan at the time. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and these other kings. And he said, basically, come together and let's fight. Joshua turns back at that time. He captures Hazor and he kills its king. Okay? Now, Jabin, king of Hazor, dead at the hands of Joshua and his army. You with me? Because here's the reason that some scholars say there's a contradiction. If you go to Judges chapter 4, in Judges chapter 4, you have the following. 4:1 and 2. The people of Israel, remember Joshua was dead, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died, and the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. And the scholars say, well, wait a minute, Hazor was totally destroyed, and Jabin was killed. And I was asked this question when we were dealing with the Joshua text, and I told someone in class, I hope you're here today, I said, we'll deal with this when we get to Judges. Jabin, was he king of Hazor, or was he king of Canaan, dwelling in the ruins of Hazor, or with some claim to the capital city? And that's the issue. Now, I do want us to have some common sense about this. 30 pages in my Bible covers 50 years of history. No, the book of Joshua is 30 pages, and it's got to have probably 150 to 200 years of history in 30 pages. It wasn't written as a who's who of the king world. Now, let's just do common sense here. I want to ask you about Saddam Hussein. And I want to ask you which of these two accounts is true. President Bush went to war against Saddam Hussein, won the war, but Saddam stayed in power. Is that statement true, or is this? President Bush went to war against Saddam Hussein, won the war, and executed Saddam. How many people think it's the second statement? How many people think it's the first? Because the reason I'm asking which account is true is because two President Bushes went to war against Saddam and won the war. With one George Bush, Saddam stayed in power. With the other George Bush, he didn't. America is one of those rare countries where we actually elect our leaders, historically speaking, extremely rare. They used to get passed down from dad to son. Do you know how many King Georges there were in England? Henry VIII is the 8th because there was a 7th, 6th, 5th, 4th, not simply because Herman's Hermits needed a lyric for their song. If there's a Jabin who's the king of Hazor, and he gets killed, and his son is somehow, you know, it's interesting to read Ken Kitchen's write-up of this because he always calls the second one Jabin the Second, which is a very British thing to do. Ken Kitchen being from Liverpool and a Brit. The idea that there is another Jabin who is a ruler there would not be offensive to anyone. Listen, anybody who's bright enough to put together this book of Judges the way these scholars think someone may have put together is not such an idiot that they would not try to fix this problem if it were real. But the problem's not a real problem. So what do we do with these contradictions? Well, here's my view. These don't prove the story, but they certainly don't disprove the story. These are neutral facts. The fact that Joshua says the kings were defeated, but not the inhabitants, and the fact that Judges says the inhabitants were still there, which is important for you to understand that the Israelites were marrying the women of the inhabitants. Most of the men were gone, but the women were still there. And the Hebrew men were marrying the foreign women, the pagan women. And it was a cause of a problem. That's the reason it's put in there, to explain. These aren't contradictions. Now, the final thing that I want to give you, and we've got 5 minutes, so we're going to look at this very briefly, but this one really makes me chuckle, but it's also very serious. There are a number of people writing today who believe that the Israelites never, forget the Moses story, forget the Exodus, Abraham, that's a laugh. Isaac, Jacob, a laugh. Not historical. Never lived, never existed, weren't real people. In fact, the Israelites themselves weren't foreign invaders into Canaan. They were actually just Canaanites that kind of came out of the woodwork together and formed a loose federation of 12 tribes. Now, this isn't something that I've made up for us to have some entertainment on Sunday morning. You can watch this on TV, on the Discovery Network. You can see these scholars, and some of them are really good scholars, making these statements as if they are so true that anybody who doesn't believe them is naive, if not stupid. Now, how did we get here? The Israelites were really Canaanites. Well, it was a multi-step process. Back in the 1930s and 40s, there was an American archaeologist named William F. Albright, who was a brilliant archaeologist, a brilliant Bible scholar. He was a Methodist minister. He was brilliant with languages. He knew his Semitic languages very well. He went over and did what they called at the time biblical archaeology. And it was Albright's belief and the belief of some of his students and people who followed his train of thought that archaeology revealed that Israel came in conquest and wiped out all of these cities. It's called the conquest model. Wiped out all of these cities, and archaeology proves the consistency of the biblical text by and large. Not exactly in their book, but by and large. Now the problem is, as scholarship continued to increase, there was a recognition that that's not really what archaeology shows, that it doesn't match up so handily like a hand in a glove, and if the glove don't fit, you must acquit. I'm sorry, I went back into law. The glove doesn't fit the hand quite perfectly. And so that opened the door for another scholastic step. But before we get there, contemporary and challenging Albright at the same time was a group of scholars headed by Germans, specifically Albrecht Alt and Martin Noth, who was his student. And they suggested that it wasn't a conquest, that it was a peaceful infiltration. The Israelites just kind of came in peacefully. And each camp took the good facts for their position and ignored the bad ones as much as they could. Didn't want to include all the facts. Then you get to this fellow named George Mendenhall, who is like real left. I mean, he's like a social left, way out guy. And he decided that this was some of the first earliest communism, that the Israelites were the first peasant uprising, revolt. And this was a social thing, and it was the lower class revolting against the upper class, and that's where the Israelites came from. The problem is, all of these people argued that something deviated from the historicity of the biblical text, that the Bible text is not right. And so once the Bible text is not right, you start coming up with all of these other ways to try and explain what's out there. Even the conquest model, that's not what the Bible claims, the way Albright understood it at least, and his protégés. So what it does is it leaves the door open for people to answer the question, where did these people come from? Because there is a huge population increase at the exact right time biblically when the Israelites went in there. There is a 5-fold increase in the population of Israel. There are hundreds of towns and villages established within 1 to 2 generations, all in the same time, all seeming to be consistent. Some will even admit they had to be Israelites because it's some of the few towns and villages in Israel where there were no pig bones. So there was no pork in the diet. And so the question for all these scholars is, well, where did all these people come from? And this is what's allowed this new view to come out that, oh, they were just the sheep herder Canaanites and the goat herder Canaanites who were having trouble trading for grain down in the lowlands, so they went up in the mountains and started growing their own and forming their own little villages all at one time. I'm going to suggest to you next week that the Israelites were Canaanites. The facts behind that actually substantiate the biblical account, not draw away from it. So next week we'll look at that together. Here are your points for home for today. The Israelites, by the way, were not Canaanites. Points for home. These are the kings of the land whom Joshua and the people defeated. I am amazed when you read those king lists that those guys' names are still around. If my name is around in 3,000 years, A, heaven helps society. But B, I hope it's not because I was in rebellion to God. That is not the legacy I want to lead. And I would suggest that you take time to identify when your life seems more rebellious. Are there times when you have greater difficulty following the Lord than other times? Is it when you're here or there? Is it in the morning or in the evening? Is it when food's in front of you or not in front of you? Is it whatever your struggles are? Is it when you're with certain people in your work or not? Or certain friends or not? Whatever your social circle or financial circle or whatever your circle is, identify times of rebellion and start praying about them. God, release me from this. Help me to find sustenance in your strength in this time so that I don't turn to rebellion. Point for home too. God said, behold, I've allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain. Now that's very clear. God did say, I'm going to give you the land. But he left the Israelites to follow his will to conquer it, and they did not do that. And I'm convinced that there are blessings that God has in your life and mine that only come when we're in his will. So identify those challenging areas where you're not in his will or where it's hard to stay in his will, and make a decision you're going to trust him and just walk. Just take a moment, time out. I'm turning the screen off. Identify in your life challenging areas where you're having trouble accepting God's will. And just make the decision prayerfully, God, I'm going to accept your will and I'm going to do what you want me to do. And I promise you, if you sit back and faithfully watch, he will take care of you. He will not let you fall. Last point. Jabin. Which one? Jabin the first, Jabin the second, Jabin the fifth, Henry the eighth, George the third, George Herbert Walker, George Walker Herbert Bush. You've got a legacy. You've got people who are going to follow you. They may not share your name, but they're going to follow you. They'll follow you in rebellion, or they'll follow you in submission. So watch your legacy and let it be a light on a hill. Would you pray with me? Lord, thank you so much that we have a chance to study your word. And thank you for providing and revealing yourself to us through your word. It's our prayer that we'll learn to understand it for the ways you've written it, with humility, with no arrogance. And Lord, where our readings are wrong, or would you help us change them? Where our readings are right, would you reinforce them and encourage us? Because our desire, Lord, is to see Jesus in our life and to bring you glory as a light set upon a hill and to be with you eternally. We love you. Through Jesus we pray, amen.